A black man traveling in first class is suddenly treated like any other regular passenger when the flight crew refuses to give him VIP treatment. Dismissive, arrogant, and assuming he doesn't belong, the crew offers him the bare minimum service, completely ignoring the status he holds. But what happens next will leave the entire crew speechless. When the man calmly reveals that he's not just a regular traveler, but the owner of the airline, everything changes in an instant. What follows is a twist that leaves everyone stunned and opens up a much-needed conversation about respect and bias in customer service. The bustling terminal of the airport was filled with the usual pre-flight chaos, people hustling through security, last-minute check-ins, and the occasional loudspeaker announcement. Amongst the crowd, a well-dressed black man walked confidently toward his flight gate, carrying himself with a quiet but undeniable authority. His attire was simple: an elegant black jacket, designer jeans, and a pair of sunglasses. But there was something about him that set him apart. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't stressed. He was just a man going about his business, until the moment he stepped onto the plane. As he boarded the aircraft and made his way to his first-class seat, he was greeted with standard pleasantries by the flight attendants. At first, everything seemed normal, until the crew's treatment of him started to shift. He noticed the brief glance exchanged between the attendants as he settled into his seat, but he dismissed it. Perhaps they were just busy with their duties. But things took a turn when the flight crew began their service. The usual VIP treatment didn't come his way. A flight attendant, who had been cordial to other first-class passengers, approached him with a distant smile, offering him a drink without any of the usual warmth or extra attention. She quickly moved on, clearly eager to attend to others. Another attendant walked by without offering any of the special accommodations typically reserved for first-class passengers. He thought nothing of it at first, but the subtle dismissiveness began to nag at him. From his seat, he watched the crew treat the other passengers differently, offering them extra blankets, hot towels, and personal attention. Yet, for him, nothing. He was being treated like just another person on the plane. No special treatment, no recognition. And it didn't sit right with him. But he remained quiet. There was a larger picture that was about to unfold, one that would shake the flight crew to their core. As the flight progressed, the subtle neglect of the black man in first class grew more apparent. It wasn't that the crew was overtly rude, but their actions spoke louder than words. The flight attendant who had first approached him offered a polite smile, but quickly moved on to assist a white passenger seated nearby, even though the man had been waiting a little longer. Another attendant walked down the aisle, stopping by other first-class passengers to ask about their comfort and offering them drinks and snacks. But when she passed by his seat, she barely made eye contact. He remained seated, pretending not to notice, but the injustice simmered within him. He had been in situations like this before, where people made assumptions about who he was based on the color of his skin. But this time, it wasn't just an ordinary interaction. It was personal. The flight crew had assumed that because he didn't look like a typical VIP, he didn't deserve the special treatment that came with it. It was the subtle biases that played out right in front of him. And, though he could feel his blood pressure rising, he kept his cool. At one point, the flight attendant returned with a drink for another passenger seated nearby. The man politely asked her, "Excuse me, I'd like a refill on my drink, please." But instead of responding, the flight attendant hesitated and glanced away, as though she hadn't heard him. "I said I'd like a refill, please," he repeated, his voice calm but firmer now, catching her attention. She blinked, slightly caught off guard by his request. "Oh, "I'm sorry, sir. I'll be right with you." Minutes passed. The drink still hadn't arrived. The man could feel his frustration building, not because he was thirsty, but because the blatant disregard was becoming more impossible to ignore. He had been overlooked for basic service, denied the VIP treatment other passengers had received, and now it was clear that the flight crew was treating him this way purely based on assumptions. The tipping point came when the flight attendants began serving the meals. The man had barely been acknowledged as they handed out trays of food to the other passengers, and it was becoming obvious that they were avoiding him. The moment was uncomfortable, and not just for him. There was a subtle tension in the air, an uneasy realization that the crew's behavior was becoming more blatant. It wasn't that he was expecting anything more than what he was due as a first-class passenger, but the unfairness of the situation gnawed at him. His patience was running thin, but he kept calm, not wanting to escalate things. He knew that sometimes patience was the best way to handle these situations, but he also knew that some moments called for action. His sense of justice, his awareness that he had every right to be treated with the same respect as anyone else, was beginning to take over. When the lead flight attendant passed by again, he decided it was time. His voice remained even as he calmly called out to her. "Excuse me," he said. "I've been waiting for my drink and meal, and I've noticed that the service for other passengers seems to be a little more thorough." The flight attendant looked at him with a polite but distracted expression. "Sir, your meal will be served shortly," she said, quickly turning away. But he wasn't letting it go. This wasn't just about a meal anymore. He was being ignored, dismissed, and treated as though he didn't matter simply because of who he was. This time, he didn't just wait. He stood up and stopped the attendant. "I've been polite, and I've been patient," he said firmly. "But it's clear I'm not being treated the same way as everyone else here, and I'd like an explanation." The flight attendant, flustered now, stammered. "Sir, we are doing our best. There are many passengers to attend to." "I understand that, but what I'm saying is that I'm being treated differently than the other passengers here," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "And I'd like to know why." At this moment, the younger flight attendant, who had been avoiding eye contact and who had been serving passengers further down the aisle, overheard the exchange and looked up. She was beginning to realize what was happening, but still, the arrogance of the senior flight attendant seemed to hold sway. The senior attendant, however, knew something was wrong. The man wasn't just another irritated customer. He wasn't a random passenger voicing a complaint. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," the senior attendant said, her voice now lower, trying to placate him. "It's just, we've been busy and—" "That's not it," the man interrupted, his patience running out. "It's clear you've been treating me differently from the others. It's not about the service. It's about how I'm being seen." He paused for a moment, his words sinking in. "And you may want to know who you're dealing with." The attendant looked up, clearly confused. He smiled slightly, a small shift in his demeanor before he added, "I am the owner of this airline." The words seemed to hit the crew like a shockwave. The senior flight attendant froze, her face going pale. The younger attendant looked between her colleague and the man, disbelief slowly replacing the defensiveness in her posture. You're the owner?" the senior attendant asked, struggling to process the revelation. "Yes, I am. And I suggest you remember this the next time you decide to make assumptions about who belongs in first class." The crew, who had assumed this man was just a regular passenger, now found themselves on the receiving end of a profound lesson in respect and humility. The air in the first-class cabin shifted as soon as the black man revealed his identity, as the owner of the airline. The flight attendants, who had been dismissing him up until this point, stood frozen in disbelief. The senior flight attendant, now pale with shock, fumbled for words as the weight of the situation dawned on her. You're the owner?" she asked, her voice trailing off in uncertainty. "Yes," the man replied firmly, his voice calm yet carrying a weight that immediately commanded attention. "I am the owner of this airline, and I expect to be treated with the same respect as any other VIP passenger, regardless of how I look or who you assume me to be." The crew's discomfort was palpable. The younger flight attendant, who had been standing off to the side, now looked at her colleague, her face a mixture of guilt and surprise. She had remained silent throughout the interaction, but now she realized how she, too, had been complicit in the bias that had taken place. The senior flight attendant, regaining some of her composure, glanced nervously around the cabin. She tried to recover from the shock of the moment, but the damage had been done. The realization that they had treated the airline's owner as just another regular passenger had shattered their facade of professionalism. The power dynamic had completely shifted in the man's favor, and they were left scrambling to react. I'm so sorry, sir," the senior attendant stammered, looking at the man with a mix of embarrassment and regret. "We didn't know. We've been so busy. It was a mistake, and we'll correct it immediately." The man didn't immediately respond, allowing the words to sink in. The awkward silence that filled the cabin was thick. The other passengers, some of whom had been quietly observing the scene, were now whispering among themselves, realizing what had just transpired. Some were shocked, others uncomfortable, and some were already pulling out their phones to capture the incident. The flight attendants had no choice but to acknowledge the gravity of their mistake. The man, despite the situation, didn't seem angry, at least not in the way one might expect. He was calm, composed, but his words had made it clear that he would not tolerate disrespect, no matter who was involved. "I've had enough of this," the man said finally, his voice still composed but now laced with authority. "You've assumed I didn't belong here based on the way I look, and that's not just disrespectful to me. It's disrespectful to everyone you serve. I don't care who you think I am, but I will not tolerate being treated this way." The flight attendants nodded, realizing the seriousness of the moment. The younger attendant spoke up quietly, her voice shaky. We've failed you, sir. We truly apologize for our behavior. It will not happen again." The senior attendant, now visibly uncomfortable, addressed the other passengers with a soft apology for the disturbance. The atmosphere in the cabin was tense, with everyone fully aware of what had just unfolded. "I think it's best if we fix this situation now," the man continued, still maintaining his composure. "I want a full apology, not just from you, but from the airline. This behavior cannot continue in any form, especially within the company I own." The senior attendant agreed immediately, nodding profusely. "Of course, sir. We'll address this internally. We will do everything we can to make it right." The flight attendants tried to recover the moment by offering him the best service they could muster. The rest of the passengers in first class, sensing the awkwardness, began to murmur among themselves. Some offered nods of acknowledgement. Others leaned back in their seats, unsure of how to react to the unfolding drama. However, the tension was still thick, and no amount of polite service could undo the damage that had been done. The flight crew, for all their attempts to reset the situation, knew that the power dynamic had shifted. The man had made it clear. He wasn't just a passenger. He was the owner, and that fact alone was enough to remind them of the responsibility they held in their position of service. Despite the uneasy tension, The flight attendants worked hard to correct their behavior, offering him the best possible service for the remainder of the flight. But the damage was already done. The moment of humiliation for them was unavoidable, and the lesson would linger with them for a long time. The man, on the other hand, remained calm and collected. He didn't seek vengeance, nor did he want to escalate the situation any further. His message had been clear and direct, and his response was measured. He had done what was necessary to make his point without resorting to anger or aggression. His calm, dignified response had exposed the biases of the flight crew and forced them to confront their assumptions about him based on his appearance. As the plane continued its journey, the crew couldn't help but reflect on the exchange. The senior flight attendant, who had been the most dismissive, now quietly pondered how differently the situation might have gone had she not jumped to conclusions. The younger flight attendant, who had watched it all unfold, began to realize how easy it was for prejudice to seep into her own actions without even being aware of it. For the man, the experience was not just about correcting the crew's mistakes. It was about showing them, and everyone who had witnessed the exchange, that no one should be treated differently because of their race, appearance, or background. He had not raised his voice. He hadn't made a scene. But his actions spoke volumes. The situation was a wake-up call, not just for the flight crew, but for the airline industry as a whole. The man's dignified approach had forced everyone involved to recognize the biases that existed in places where they shouldn't. On an airplane, with people who were supposed to provide service to all passengers equally, and it wasn't just a lesson for the flight crew. It was one for the entire airline. The flight continued without incident after the man revealed his true identity, but the events that transpired didn't end with the flight itself. The ripple effects of what had happened aboard that plane began to spread far beyond the first-class cabin, where the incident had unfolded. As soon as the plane touched down, the man noticed something odd. His phone, which had been on silent during the flight, began to buzz incessantly with notifications. He glanced at it and saw a flood of messages, alerts, and social media posts. People had caught wind of the incident. It had already gone viral. It wasn't just the passengers who had witnessed the scene. The bystanders, including the flight crew themselves, had quickly realized the weight of the situation. Someone, possibly a fellow passenger or a flight crew member, had discreetly shared the video of the confrontation on social media. The video showing the man confronting the flight attendants with quiet authority had captured the attention of viewers who were now flooding the comment sections with their opinions. The news spread like wildfire. Headlines soon followed. Man denied VIP treatment reveals he owns the airline. The viral clip quickly amassed millions of views, and social media was buzzing with reactions from people around the world. Many were outraged by the blatant disregard for the man's status and the way the flight crew had treated him, judging him based on his appearance rather than his actual identity. For the man, however, it wasn't about gaining attention or seeking retribution. It was about making a larger point. His calm, controlled response had exposed a flaw, not just in one airline's service, but in how people are too often judged based on assumptions. His decision to reveal his identity wasn't an act of arrogance. It was a chance to force others to confront the biases they often overlook. The airline, too, found itself in the spotlight. Within hours of the video going viral, the company's social media channels were flooded with messages of anger and disappointment from customers and the public. People were calling for the resignation of the crew involved and demanding that the airline take responsibility for the incident. There was outrage over how a man who had invested in the company could be treated so poorly by the very people employed to serve him. In response, The airline issued a public statement apologizing for the incident. They promised to conduct an internal investigation and review their policies on customer service and diversity training. However, this was only the beginning of the fallout. As the public outcry grew, the company had no choice but to take further action. The incident highlighted a much larger issue within the airline industry, and people were now calling for widespread changes. The flight crew members involved were placed on leave, pending the outcome of the investigation. The senior flight attendant, who had been the most dismissive, expressed deep regret for her actions, admitting in an interview that she had let her assumptions about the man's appearance cloud her judgment. She described how the entire incident had made her reevaluate her own behavior and the biases she hadn't even realized she was carrying. The younger attendant, who had been complicit but hesitant throughout the interaction, also came forward, acknowledging how her inaction had played a part in the mistreatment. Both attendants, alongside the airline, promised to undergo training in diversity and cultural sensitivity to ensure that something like this never happened again. Meanwhile, the man, the airline's owner, kept his distance from the media frenzy. He wasn't interested in making the story about himself. Instead, he chose to speak on the larger issue of racism, assumptions, and bias in service industries. In interviews, he made it clear that his intention was never to embarrass the flight crew or to take advantage of his position. He simply wanted to highlight how easily people could be misjudged based on the color of their skin, and how those biases affected the way people were treated, regardless of their status, wealth, or position. "I'm not angry," he said in one interview. "What happened on that plane was a reflection of something much bigger than a single mistake. It's about how we, as a society, too often judge people by their appearance, by assumptions we make. It's about recognizing that we all deserve respect, regardless of who we are or how we look." His calm, reflective response to the entire situation made him an even more respected figure. He used the viral incident to spark discussions on a national level about racial discrimination and the assumptions people make about others based on their appearance. The backlash the airline faced didn't stop at the flight attendants involved. Customers began to question whether their own experiences with the airline had been tainted by similar biases, and they demanded better treatment. The airline's reputation, once strong, was now in jeopardy. The company had no choice but to reevaluate its practices to ensure that something like this would never happen again. The incident became a key moment in the broader conversation about racism in public services, particularly in industries where customer service plays a crucial role. The man's actions proved that standing up for yourself doesn't always require anger or confrontation. His dignified approach had forced an entire industry to rethink how it treated its passengers and to look deeper at the biases ingrained in everyday service. The viral video of the incident was a turning point, not just for the airline, but for the larger conversation about race, respect, and how people are treated in society. And though the man remained out of the media spotlight, his quiet leadership left a lasting impact, reminding everyone that sometimes the most powerful change comes from the most unexpected places. In the weeks that followed the viral incident, the fallout from the black man's revelation of his identity continued to reverberate. The airline, which had been thrown into a national spotlight, now faced intense scrutiny. But they also saw an opportunity to make real, lasting changes. The public outcry wasn't just about the mistreatment of one individual. It was a broader commentary on racial bias, assumptions, and how society often judges people based on appearances. The airline's leadership realized that they had to take full responsibility and implement concrete reforms, not just for the sake of their reputation, but to foster a more inclusive and respectful environment for all customers. The airline quickly began the process of reviewing its training programs, ensuring that diversity, respect, and customer service became core pillars of their operation. They committed to launching mandatory anti-bias workshops for all employees, starting with the flight attendants involved in the incident. These workshops would focus on recognizing implicit biases and challenging stereotypes, something that had been glaringly absent in the way the black man had been treated on that flight. The CEO of the airline personally reached out to the man, offering a formal apology for the incident and asking for his input on how the company could move forward. The man, though initially reluctant to engage in public spectacle, agreed to meet with the CEO. Their conversation centered on how companies in the service industry could do better in addressing issues of race and bias. The man's experience as both a passenger and the owner of the airline gave him a unique perspective. He didn't want to see anyone else go through what he had endured, and his influence was instrumental in encouraging the airline to make real, systemic changes. The airline's commitment to change was more than just a public relations effort. The leadership understood that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger societal issue. Their efforts to implement widespread changes were seen as a step in the right direction. They didn't just apologize. They took tangible actions to prevent similar mistakes in the future. Meanwhile, the public's response to the viral incident remained mixed. Some applauded the man's calm, dignified handling of the situation, viewing it as a powerful example of resilience. Others criticized the airline, feeling that the apology wasn't enough and that more drastic measures should have been taken to ensure accountability for the crew members. The incident sparked a larger conversation across social media and news outlets about racial bias in service industries, with many demanding that other companies follow suit in addressing implicit bias and ensuring fair treatment for all customers, regardless of race or appearance. For the man, the entire situation had not been about personal vindication. It had been about challenging the assumptions that people often make about others. He never intended for the incident to become so public, but once the video went viral, he saw it as an opportunity to make a difference. He didn't raise his voice or escalate the situation into conflict. Instead, he used his position, his calm demeanor, and his unwavering conviction to show the flight crew and the world that respect isn't something that should be given based on someone's race or status. It's something everyone deserves, no matter who they are. Despite the public attention, the man remained focused on the bigger picture. He used his platform to advocate for more meaningful conversations about racial discrimination, not just in customer service, but in all areas of society. He spoke about how everyday assumptions could perpetuate harmful stereotypes, and how the biases many people weren't even aware they held could impact others' lives. He used the moment to challenge people to think beyond their initial judgments and to treat everyone with fairness and dignity. As time went on, the incident became a case study in diversity training programs. The video of the man's confrontation with the flight attendants was shared by educational institutions, advocacy groups, and companies looking to improve their practices. The man's approach to handling the situation became a model for how to confront discrimination without resorting to anger or hostility. His story was a reminder that standing up for yourself doesn't always require a confrontation. It can be done through dignity, calmness, and the unwavering commitment to doing what's right. The flight attendants, who had initially been embarrassed by their actions, now found themselves reflecting on their behavior and undergoing intensive training. They, too, understood that their assumptions had been wrong. They had treated someone based on preconceived notions rather than recognizing him as an individual. In the aftermath, both the senior and junior flight attendants expressed regret and acknowledged that they had learned a valuable lesson about respect and the importance of seeing people for who they are, not for what they think they should be. The community, inspired by the man's story, began to discuss broader social issues, racism, biases, and how they manifest in everyday life. The conversation extended beyond airlines and customer service. People started asking questions about how they treat others in all areas of life, at work, at home, in schools, and on the streets. The viral video became a symbol of how a single individual's quiet strength could spark a much-needed conversation and lead to real societal change. The man's legacy went beyond that single encounter on the plane. He became an advocate for accountability, for breaking down the barriers of bias, and for creating spaces where everyone is treated equally. His story wasn't just one of personal victory. It was a victory for the wider cause of racial equality and social justice. In the end, the lesson was clear. Respect is not a privilege granted based on who you are perceived to be. It's a fundamental right that everyone should receive. No matter where you come from, how you look, or what you own, dignity and fairness should never be withheld. The viral incident changed the way people thought about customer service, race, and justice, proving that a calm and measured response could make all the difference in the world. The story of the black man who quietly confronted the flight crew about their bias not only made waves in the airline industry, but sparked a broader conversation about racial bias, respect, and equality. His dignified response to the situation didn't just challenge the flight attendants. It challenged all of us to think about how we treat others, regardless of their appearance or status. His message was clear. Respect is a right, not a privilege. The airline's swift actions to address the incident were just the beginning. This story became a turning point for many, highlighting the importance of accountability and how powerful it can be to stand up for what's right, without resorting to anger or confrontation. It's a reminder that true change often starts with a single person, standing firm in their values. What about you? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you were judged unfairly based on assumptions? How did you handle it? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share your own story of resilience. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories about standing up against injustice, promoting equality, and making a difference in the world. Together, we can all contribute to making society a more respectful and inclusive place. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more powerful stories that inspire change and challenge the status quo.